For our next talk, we have Monisha Ghosh. She currently is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Notre Dame, and she's also the policy outreach director for SpectrumX, which, as you all know by now, is the first NSF Center for Spectrum Innovation. She's also the co-chair for the FCC's Technical Advisory Council Working Group, which focuses on advanced spectrum sharing. Monisha's interests in terms of research are in the development of next-generation wireless systems, such as cellular, Wi-Fi, and IoT, and that all with an emphasis on spectrum sharing and coexistence. Before joining the University of Notre Dame, which happened in 2022, Monisha was the Chief Technology Officer of the Federal Communications Commission. She was before that a program director at the National Science Foundation and funded some of my research in this space. And she was a research professor at the University of Chicago. She spent 24 years in industry at Bell Labs, Philips Research, and InterDigital, where she worked on a wide variety of wireless systems, such as digital TV, Wi-Fi, TV white spaces, and cellular. She has a bachelor's of technology from Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur, and also a PhD from the University of Southern California. She's a fellow of the IEEE. And with all that trove of expertise, we're so excited to have you. She's going to tell us about cellular measurements and a couple of emerging cellular network technologies today. All right, so with that, Monisha, thanks again.
Thank you, Maria, for the introduction. I'm really sorry I couldn't be at one of the locations in person. I was hoping to be there. It really looks like an exciting event that you have going there. So let me share my slides. I hope everybody can see them.
Yes, looking good here.
So what I'll talk about, and Maria has given me a little bit of a summary of the talks that have gone before, but there may be some overlap that ends up. I'm happy to take questions either we have about an hour, so either during the talk or at the end. I just can't see the chat while I'm presenting. So Maria or Anya, if please feel free to interrupt me if there are questions as I'm going.
We'll moderate that and pass along.
Yeah. So what I want to talk about today is some of the work actually that we've been doing in my research group, where we've been really focusing on real world performance measurements. And we've been doing this for both cellular and Wi-Fi. And I guess what is a little bit different is we're basically using smartphones for all of this work. And hopefully by the end of the hour, I will get some of you interested in actually trying out some of these techniques because they're pretty easy to use. Down below, there's a list of my students and postdocs over the years that have been my collaborators in doing this work, and my email. If anybody has any questions about what I'll talk about now, please feel free to email me if you want more information. So when we started doing this work about maybe, I don't know, about 8 to 9 years ago, I used to be asked the question a lot. You're an academic. I came from industry, but I was in academia, and I was really interested in measuring deployed networks. And I would often get pushback from other academics as well as in industry. It's like, why are you doing this? And I would remember a quote that a colleague of mine, actually, when I was in industry, had up on his door, which was probably misattributed to Yogi Berra. He said a lot of pity things, but I don't think he said this one, which is, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So if you think about that statement for a minute, it's actually pretty profound. So a lot of what we have in wireless networks today, and you've heard a lot about wireless networks, you've played around with some Wi-Fi. A lot of that is actually built on very good theory. So we really understand how to model many, many aspects of this environment that wireless networks operate in. But eventually, when you go out there and you deploy them, there is a mismatch between what is actually happening in the real world and what the theory predicts that should be happening. And so that is what drives a lot of the work that I will be presenting right now. And here are some of the questions I get, like, isn't performance simulated by standards bodies? And two of the standards bodies that are involved in this process, major ones are IEEE 802.11 that develops the Wi-Fi standards that we all use, and 3GPP that develops the cellular standards. And of course, there are lots of simulations and channel modeling as these standards get developed as part of the process. But by and large, when you think about the channel itself, these are based on assumptions, models, and on very, very limited channel measurements. The next question I get is, operators do this all the time. They deploy a network, they go out and measure it, and it's absolutely true they do, but their goal is different. Their goal is to try and see whether what they've deployed is working well, and they will only report good news. They will not report the bad news, right? And most importantly, researchers like us in academia do not have access to the raw data. Today, in particular, as there's so much focus on using AI and ML for wireless networks, getting real-world data, how these networks are actually behaving, is absolutely crucial. The good thing is today, as we have all of this latest stuff getting deployed around us, new generations of Wi-Fi, new generations of 5G cellular, and in new bands that weren't used before, we can actually do a lot of measurements ourselves. And these measurements in realistic environments, if you walk around in your university campuses, there's Wi-Fi everywhere, there's cellular everywhere, you have base stations on lampposts and street corners and stadiums. If we can figure out how to take measurements easily without, rolling carts of equipment around to do it, it makes the barrier to entry for anybody to take these kind of measurements and analyze them meaningfully is lowered. I actually, in some other talks, I call this the democratization of channel measurements, because honestly, it's really become a lot easier these days. The other important thing to note is that as opposed to very carefully calibrated measurement setups where you're doing channel propagation studies, when you take measurements, say, using a smartphone, that actually captures the entirety of the channel, not just the physical medium that the signal went through, say from the base station to the phone, but also the phone itself. So what we sometimes forget is that the front end receivers on your phone, the antennas you use, the fact that you may be holding the phone and obstructing some of the antennas, or maybe your body is not turned exactly pointed towards where the base station is. I mean, how many of us actually know where the base station is when we are using our phones? So all of those realistic, real-world effects on how the channel behaves, you automatically get that without trying to set up an environment in a lab where you're trying to model these effects. Of course, there are a lot of drawbacks to doing things this way. It's very difficult to have repeatability. So we have lots of data where you go to the same place one day and things look very different from the next day, and we don't really know what changed. But that is also inherently the nature of wireless communications. It is a statistical phenomena, and the ability to make measurements over time and space is actually quite important. We can't control what the base stations are doing. Wi-Fi, especially if it's in a university environment, we have a little bit more control over the access points, but even then, we don't really have control of the traffic. What are other users on the network doing? And so it becomes very important to truly understand the systems and use that to not only collect the data, but curate it and analyze it so that you take into account all of these things that, some things you can control, some things you can't. And what are the benefits of doing this? The biggest benefit of doing this in an academic environment is it's unbiased, right? Our goal is really to understand what's going on. We are not interested necessarily in proving something is better than the other. We are just interested in going out there and getting the unbiased measurements. We can do this, we can monitor the health of broadband networks and really understand what's going on so we know how to design, say, 6G or design the next Wi-Fi. I particularly like to do this work because it keeps service providers honest. We have multiple results where we've taken measurements, a lot of measurements in certain areas, and those don't line up very well with what, say, a provider is saying you should be getting. So we can verify claims of coverage, throughput, latency. And then the digital divide is something that I'm very interested in. And taking the measurements and showing exactly what is available is really important if we want to inform these discussions with data. Another big part of this is really understanding where do we need more research? Do the measurements we're making match predictions from propagation analysis? If not, we want to go back and look at the propagation analysis again. I know there was a presentation by Andy on some of these matters, and I don't know if he mentioned it, but CBRS is an example of how after being deployed for a while, measurements being made, they went and reworked some of the propagation models. So this is a continuous process, which I think is a really important part of wireless and spectrum sharing in particular. We can try to measure interference and figure out how you can share more effectively. And I firmly believe that if we really want to improve how we are sharing spectrum, we have to do more and more measurements. Then the question is, how do we do that? In the past, this was really difficult to do. Operators or wireless carriers, they did drive tests with very special purpose, expensive equipment. But today we can do substantially the same thing using smartphones because the capability, and I'll talk about that later, has really improved. We can do crowdsourcing of measurements, and there are a lot of apps already out there that do this. And by doing this, you basically have much better spatial and temporal granularity that even you and I can go out and take these measurements and try to get an understanding of what's actually happening in our environment. So the smartphone today is actually an amazing measurement tool. I mean, I know most of you probably think it's just a way to make phone calls and take pictures, but there is a lot you can do with it. So if you look at just the number of wireless radios and interfaces that you have multiple Wi-Fi front ends in 2.4 and 5 have been around for a long time. And basically the new 6 gigahertz band, which has been allocated for unlicensed use, most new phones have started including that. You have all the 4G bands. There are many bands below 1 gigahertz, which are usually called the low bands. And then mid-band frequencies over time have evolved to go up to a little bit more than 2 gigahertz, actually. And all of these bands have been used for at least 10 to 15 years. 5G, again, you have the low and the mid bands. The mid bands have moved up to 4 gigahertz now. And you got added into it the high bands, the millimeter wave bands, which I'll talk about, which is greater than 24 gigahertz. Now, 24 gigahertz or millimeter wave, if you want to actually do measurements with a professional equipment, it's really, really expensive because these are very professional. At that frequency, the RF front ends are much more difficult. But you have it in your phone today. And why not try to take advantage of what all of us are carrying around with us? There is a caveat. Most of what you can do and what I'll talk about only works on Android. iOS also has all of these bands, all of these radios, but they are a much more closed ecosystem. So they don't have APIs that allow you to extract some of these signals. Whereas in Android phones, on the Wi-Fi side, you can get the standard metrics like the received signal strength indicator, the RSSI, the frequency, the bandwidth, what is the AP capable of. And there are many, many optional elements that are actually broadcast in the Wi-Fi beacons. The later standards have these elements such as station count. It'll tell you how many devices are actually attached to any AP that you're scanning. How much is how busy is the channel? What is the transmit power? On the cellular side, again, you can get the information about all of the cells that are in your area, not just the one you're connected to. You can get the signal strength, the RSRP. You can get the signal quality, the RSRQ. You can get the signal to interference noise, not ratio, or the SINR. And in addition to this passive signal strength extraction, you can also run an active speed tests. So you can either do iPerf, which I believe some of you may have used in your Wi-Fi lab work that you did during the summer school. But you can also use speed test apps like the one we use a lot is the FCC speed test and Ookla. And that tells you about just your downlink, uplink, throughput, and your latency and ping results. But just the speed test does not provide the detailed understanding that you can get from the signal strength measurements, because these networks are incredibly complex. They're multi-user networks. So you can run a speed test and get a really good data rate, and then you can run another speed test and the data rate might be very low or much higher. And that all depends on what else is going on in the network that you have no control over. So what we have found is that speed tests are a good metric, but when combined with the signal strength information, you get a much nicer picture of what's actually going on in your network. And that applies to both cellular and Wi-Fi. So let me talk about some of the tools that we use. There are many tools that are available, but when we started doing this work, what we found is that you had a separate tool for Wi-Fi, a separate tool for cellular. Many times you could see the information in the user interface, but you couldn't really save and download it for later analysis. So my student, who's now a postdoc with me, Mohammed, he set out to write his own app where we could do we could basically combine cellular, LTE, NR, Wi-Fi. And actually this display doesn't show it, but the latest one also includes GPS information. So not just like what you're seeing, well over here I'm not showing it, but not just the GPS location, but actually the individual signal strength from every satellite that your phone can see. So there are these 4 constellations that are out there, and every satellite is transmitting and your phone is receiving the signals from these satellites all the time, and it's decoding it. So all we are doing is tapping into that satellite receiver on the phone and extracting the raw signal. Because now we can do a lot more if we actually know what is the signal strength you receive.
Monisha, just a quick note. So for anyone who has an Android phone in the audience, if you go to the main Slack channel for students, you can see a link there to where you can go and download the SIGCAP, the latest of the SIGCAP app. So if you want to play with it now or after the talk, that's available to you.
Yeah, and there are 2 versions you'll see if you go to that link. One is this one that I'm showing here, which is labeled debug, which is really the one that we use for a lot of our development and has all the latest things that we've been doing. And there's a green one, which is more of an outward-facing app. I would recommend looking at the debug. Again, this picture is an older picture. We've added iPerf into this. We've added a mapping tool into this. It's pretty easy to use. The only caveat, which I was going to talk about later too, but I'll point it out now if you're planning to download it, is where's my cursor? Okay. If you go here, this upward arrow, if you click, so this is basically you press play, it starts recording, you'll see a UE, and then you can look at what it's showing on LTE, NR, Wi-Fi. And then when you press the pause stop button, it'll stop, and all the data is stored on the phone. Now, how do you get it up to analyze? So if you hit this up button, it'll upload it to the Firebase server where this app has been designed. And then that information, which clearly, to make any sense of this, we have to take time stamps and location. So all of that information will be available. And there are some, if you don't want your location and where you're taking measurements, we don't know who you are, but we can see the phone and where that data was uploaded from. The other option is, if you look at this button, if you click that button, you have the option to just download the data yourself. You can email it to yourself or save it to a drive. And the data is all saved as JSON files. And we have scripts that can extract it into CSVs for you to analyze. And many people are really good at writing scripting themselves, but they're in easily understandable formats for you to do that. So what you're seeing over here is an example of what, say, a Wi-Fi screen would look like. You'll get the SSID, and this was captured in Notre Dame, so that's the guest network. It'll tell you the BSSID, which is the actual AP, and again, our latest interface actually has a field called AP name, so we know exactly which AP you're connected to. It'll tell you the frequency information, what you're receiving the signal strength at, and it'll give you more information about what your link speeds are, the maximum, and what you're actually using. And then, as I was saying, it'll tell you information about station count. So it'll tell you that there are 2 stations which are connected to that particular BSSID that you're connected to. It'll tell you the channel utilization, and it'll tell you the transmit power. So there's a lot of information that we can extract just from the phone itself. In the past, you need, yeah.
Hey, Monisha, it's Andy. Quick question. Is there any reason why a phone running this, an Android device running this, needs an active SIM subscription, or is it still useful data if you're running it off a phone that no longer has a subscription and you're just running it off of Wi-Fi?
No, there isn't. In fact, we have SIMs. If you want to take measurements of cellular, you will need the SIM, of course. But if all you want to do is characterize Wi-Fi, you can just run it. If you don't have a SIM in it, if you go to the LTE or NR buttons, you'll get no information. But the Wi-Fi information and the GPS information will be collect.
But the bootstrapping GPS doesn't require a 4G or 5G subscription. It'll work without.
Yeah. Right. Because it's literally going into the GPS receiver on the phone, which is always on, and because we're not really, you may not get your location accuracy, right? You may not actually be able to get your location very well, but because a lot of location services, especially Google, they like to use cellular along with GPS to get an accurate location. So you'll get a location, but it may not be as accurate. But if you want the raw signals, you can get that.
Okay, I have a drawer full of old Android phones.
Oh yeah, you can definitely.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so when we've done a lot of our Wi-Fi measurements, we also in the lab we have used Wireshark, which runs on laptops. And actually, of late, we've got Wireshark running on Raspberry Pis, which are a little bit more portable. And we're in the process of doing a wider Wi-Fi measurement campaign on campus, where we plug in Raspberry Pis with Wi-Fi dongles to really understand what's going on with Wi-Fi usage. For cellular, again, is the same thing. We use SIGCAP a lot, and this screen, again, is an old shot. It shows you what you can get on the LTE tab. It gives you PCI, which is the physical cell ID that identifies the base station that you're actually connected to. When it says true, it means you're connected to that. But over here, you'll see there are 2 base stations. There's another one which you're not connected to because it has a different PCI as this one. It's on the same channel, so ERFCN tells you what channel it's on, but I suspect the signal strength is weaker, so you're connecting to this base station instead of that. And it will give you all of the neighbor base stations or cells that are available to you. The same thing, NR is a little limited because 5G operates a little bit differently from 4G. So some of the information is a little less detailed compared to LTE, but we still get a lot of the basic information we're looking for on signal strength, what frequency band you are on, and what the cell identifier is. We also use other apps called Colipok, which Rodian Schwartz makes, and AccuVer XCal. And I know Keysight makes something as well, which again, they're smartphone based. They're basically doing the same thing, but they can extract more information by virtue of the fact that they use, and I think it works only on phones that have the Qualcomm chipset. They use the Qualcomm debug tool to drill deeper into the chips and extract much more detailed information. For example, how many resource blocks have been allocated to your device? What is the modulation coding scheme you're using? If you're using MIMO, how many layers you're using? It actually also has the RRC, the higher layer information. But it's expensive. You have to have a license for it. But we use both of these apps quite a bit to get an understanding of networks. So what can we do with these tools and what have we done? As I mentioned again, we can map these infrastructure deployment signal strengths very easily. We can quickly determine what is being deployed where. We can track down how well is spectrum being utilized. For example, we've collected a ton of data in many places, and we see that some of the Wi-Fi bands are actually not very well utilized. And we don't really crowdsource measurements because we're worried about people's privacy, but we do targeted measurements a lot. We've done a lot of verifying of coverage claims by carriers, and I'll talk about that later. And we also can do limited propagation modeling. The way this all works is you're getting a very UE-centric view of the world. So I get what I get from my phone. We don't, on the cellular side, we don't really know what's happening with the transmit power. Cellular systems use power control. But you can do relative propagation. So for example, if you look at all the data you've collected from, say, a single PCI on a single channel, at a certain time, you can use that to at least understand how the signal strength coverage varies in space for that particular cell. With Wi-Fi, actually, we are getting a little bit more information on transmit power. It's an optional element, as I mentioned. So older access points are not transmitting this information, but most newer ones do. And when we have that information, so if we know that a Wi-Fi access point is transmitting, say, 20 dBm, and your RSSI is minus, 60 dBm at a certain point, we can estimate what the propagation losses are. And actually, some of the recent work we've been doing is we've been actually comparing 5 gigahertz versus 6 gigahertz to get an understanding of what the difference in propagation is. So there's actually, even with the limited information that you gather, you can do a lot of post-processing and analysis to understand what's going on. So what I'll do for the rest of the talk is go through some examples of how we have used this combination of tools in various efforts over the years. So broadband mapping, which is generally, we're just looking at coverage. Then we looked very detailed into millimeter wave measurements in 5G. We looked at CBRS. We looked at Wi-Fi 6E, and then 5G midband. And, I make the slide available, so even if we can't go through all of it, you'll have it with you. So this is actually one of the first things that we did with this approach, And this goes back to 2020, where Congress actually, I thought this was one of the best mandates I've seen coming out of Congress, that they recommended FCC investigate whether they should partner with another federal agency like the Postal Service that operates fleet vehicles to do continuous broadband mapping. So if you think about it, postal vehicles go everywhere in the country, right, delivering mail. And if in the process of delivering mail, we can also have it collect information about networks, that would be great. And so we did this pilot over 3 weeks in April and May 2021. This was during the pandemic, which was an interesting exercise, but it was done in Longmont, Colorado. And we worked with the Postal Service. 7 of their vehicles were each outfitted with the case containing, at that time, Pixel 5 was state-of-the-art, so that's what we used. 3 Google Pixel 5 phones, 1 for each carrier, which had an unlimited data plan. And then on each phone, we installed SIGCAP, and we installed Cell Audit, which is a professional variant of the FCC speed test app that the FCC used. And we ran speed tests every minute and SIGCAP every 10 seconds. So these 3 phones were there in 7 of these vehicles every day, almost for 3 weeks, weekdays. As they went around collecting mail, they also collected a lot of data. And there's a report that I've linked to which summarizes the output. So the outcome was, this was actually the amount of data we were able to collect was amazing. So this is a map, and all these colors show you the different postal routes covered in Longmont, Colorado. Over a period of 3 weeks, we were able to actually map very well signal coverage, throughputs, and many other parameters during that process. And this shows you what that kit looked like. You had these 3 phones. The problems we ran into was not about the methodology, but other logistical constraints. So for example, the phones would heat up and shut down, and then somebody would have to go in and manually turn them on, because the Google phones don't automatically turn on after they've been powered off. One of the postal vehicles, the battery died because these phones were draining the battery so much. So it tells you how old some of these postal vehicles are, that 3 phones charging up the battery drained the battery. And then the next day, the Postal Service was pretty upset with us for having put one of the vehicles out of commission. So as a proof of concept, this really works. But what we realized is we don't need all of the stuff that's in a phone. We don't need the screen. We don't need the camera. We just need the modem functionality. And it's been a pet idea of mine that if somebody could just do this in a separate device, it would be a really nice thing to add on to do continuous monitoring of performance. So that was a really nice first step into using these techniques to map carriers. And then when I joined Notre Dame in 2022, the city of South Bend got very interested. They said, you know what, let's do this with garbage trucks. So they did the same thing. They again got phones, and they had this little kit with the phones in there. And as the garbage man went around, or a woman went around picking up garbage, this thing collected data. So we informally call this project Garbage In, Data Out. And the city of South Bend, they wrote a very nice article on it, and they also created a dashboard. So they created a dashboard where they took all the data we collected and put it on a map. So, the citizens of the city could go and look at, okay, what kind of carrier coverage do I have? And this was a lot more accurate than what the actual providers had on their websites. Now, keep in mind the rate at which cellular networks are changing. So this was done back in 2022, 23. This is all outdated at this point, because every one of these operators have upgraded their networks. And so this was a one-time thing as well. But what this points to is the need, I think, for a nationwide way of collecting data about how networks are rolling out, what the actual performance on the ground is. We've also taken this concept and implemented it within SpectrumX. I don't know whether, I think Nick gave an overview. So we have the broadband mappers, and actually Anya is there, so she knows about this a lot. Which is we've gotten a bunch of smartphones with SIM cards, and we've distributed it to a number of schools. And students, mainly undergraduates actually, collect a lot of data by walking around Wi-Fi and cellular, and we've had some very interesting discussions about what they're looking for. So one of the things is, can we look at the data and draw any conclusions about how networks are being deployed in different areas depending on the socioeconomic distribution of the population? And there are conclusions you can draw. But what I thought was really interesting was a very recent, I was in New York City last weekend, and as you can see, I did a lot of walking, and I had one phone with me. And what I was trying to see is look at how much Wi-Fi 6E, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, it's the newest Wi-Fi standard, how much of that is being deployed. And Andy, you might appreciate it to say that I was actually pretty taken aback when I looked at the data later. So keep in mind, when you're collecting the data, I'm not really analyzing it. I'm just collecting it. And then later we take the data and we map it. We look at signal strengths. And you can see that, 6E is being used quite a bit. It wasn't the same walk a year ago would have showed almost no 6E, but this month it did. So again, it shows you it's really, you can collect data as you're going around your day-to-day activities. And then when you look at the data later on, there's a lot that you can gather from it. So within SpectrumX, we are actually developing a dashboard, which is almost completed, where we are taking all of the SIGCAT data and making it easily extractable. There's a lot of metadata that sits behind this map as to channels, where it was collected, was it driving, was it walking, and other things. And so we are trying to create a dashboard where you can put filters on to extract the information that you're looking for. So watch this space. We hope to have a much better version released fairly soon. I want to quickly talk about millimeter wave. So I don't know whether millimeter wave 5G was discussed in what you have, in the previous lectures. So the biggest thing that was proposed in 5G was to really move up in frequency. So most cellular up until then was limited to the low and mid bands. And the big leap forward was that you were going to millimeter wave. Why? Because you have a lot more bandwidth there. So as an example, if you look at the total mid-band bandwidth that you have, and I'm looking just at 5G and 2.6 and 3 gigahertz, it's approximately 500 megahertz. And this is, remember, all of this is divided among 3 operators. So they're each getting, somewhere between 150 to 200 megahertz of bandwidth, which is not a huge amount. However, if you look at millimeter wave, and there are 3 bands that were auctioned, the 28 gigahertz, the 24, and the 39, it's almost close to 3 gigahertz of bandwidth. So that is an immense amount of bandwidth that you now have. And if you go back to the very basics of communication theory and channel capacity, where your capacity C is given by this relationship, where W is the bandwidth and SNR is the signal to noise ratio, you can see that there are 2 ways of increasing capacity. You improve your signal to noise ratio, or you improve your bandwidth. However, the capacity increase is linear with bandwidth. So, this is the biggest bang for the buck you get. You increase your bandwidth, you increase capacity. Signal to noise ratio, it's logarithmic. So after a certain point, it doesn't matter. Even if you increase your signal to noise ratio, your capacity is not going to increase that much. And so there is a lot of focus in cellular systems, but even Wi-Fi, in getting more and more bandwidth. And that is where we run up against spectrum crunch and trying to get more and more bandwidth. So all that's very nice. You have a lot of bandwidth up in millimeter wave, but the challenge really is now you have this frequency dependent path loss, which requires you to do much more. So the standard formula, the first formula for propagation relates your received power, P of R, to your transmitted power, P of T, your gain, transmit antenna gain, your receive antenna gain. Lambda is the wavelength, which is inverse to frequency, so it's C over F. And for pi d, d is the distance between transmitter and receiver. So this is just coming from physics of propagation. There's nothing we can do to change this fundamental physics, which says that as distance between transmitter and receiver increases and as frequency increases, the amount of power you receive is going to be inverse to the square of those quantities, right? So you're paying a huge penalty in propagation in the area you can cover as you're going up in frequency. And the only way that you can compensate for this frequency loss sitting in the denominator here is by increasing either increasing transmit power, but there are limits to how much you can transmit based on just how much you have available, and there are safety concerns, interference concerns, so this is limited. But you have the gain, the antenna gain at your disposal. So you can increase the antenna gain at both the transmitter and the receiver. But that too comes with a caveat, right? How does one increase antenna gain? You increase antenna gain by making it more and more directional. So if you think about like an analogy with a flashlight, is if you have a flashlight which is transmitting in all directions versus taking all that power and putting it into a narrow beam, you can get a lot more gain in one direction. But now what that means is you have in making sure that on both your transmitter and receiver are aligned. So there's a lot of signal processing that goes into making sure that by doing this, you can adequately compensate the frequency dependent loss. And so when 5G and millimeter wave started being deployed, there were a lot of, based on the theory, there were a lot of claims being made as to, oh, you can get a lot of propagation. All you have to do is just implement it correctly. So we did a lot of measurements in that as they started getting deployed. Again, we did this with deployed systems. So this is in Chicago. And this was, I think, in 2022 or 23. So as you can see, there were two carriers. For the paper, we didn't identify them. But I think operator X was AT&T and operator Y was Verizon. So you can see how city blocks, each of this is a block in downtown Chicago. So they had deployed pretty much in every lamppost. And many of them had basically two arrays pointed at each direction because, as I mentioned, these are very, very directional. So if you're standing here, you need a beam pointed to you from this panel because otherwise you're not going to get connected. And we did a lot of measurements. We used SIGCAP. For this particular exercise, we used actually the more professional AccuVer XCal, but again, using phones. So all the device was still the phone. It was just how you extracted the information from the phone that varied. And we came to conclusions which basically said that you have to deploy extremely densely. So the millimeter wave, the physics of propagation, ultimately really limited you to what you could get. The coverage of each of these was about half to one city block. So if you really wanted seamless coverage, you had to have, even this kind of density wasn't enough. And we walked, say, between the two, we would basically drop off the millimeter wave connection. However, when you were really close to the base station, you would get 2 to 3 gigabits per second of peak data rate, right? But only when you're very close. The other thing we uncovered was how hot these millimeter wave receptions made your phone. So your phone would heat up, and about the first 30 seconds, you would get this really nice data rate. And then after it hit a certain temperature, it would basically drop the millimeter wave connection. So there was a lot of learning we got from just using phones and the right software tools to extract information to understand what was going on. I won't go through this video, slides will be shared, but this is a really nice video that my student made where he showed how the throughput varied with the temperature, and we kind of did thermal imaging of one phone from another phone and showed the correlation between temperature and throughput. But in the interest of time, I'll skip that. Let me switch to CBRS, and again, I'll give a very short introduction because I'm not quite sure how much Andy got to speak about it. But CBRS, or the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, is this band of frequencies from 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz, where you have an incumbent, which is Navy radar, so that's the tier 1 user. And the FCC and NTIA made a decision, almost back in 2014, I think they started the discussions to allocate this band for commercial use as well without moving the Navy radars out. So there's a very neat coexistence scheme that was developed where you had a spectrum access system, or the SAS, with managed usage of these 3 tiers of users. So tier 1 is the primary user, the incumbent, Navy radars. The tier 2 were priority access licensees. These were folks that actually bought licenses at an auction to get access to the spectrum. And the third tier was called general authorized access, which is like unlicensed, what we're familiar with in Wi-Fi, but not exactly, because they too had to get authorization through the SpectrumX system. So this was one of the first real attempts to do spectrum sharing on a managed basis. And I talk about the problems first because, as a researcher, you're looking for good problems to solve, and then I will talk about how good this band is. So the problems, which I don't think a lot of people realized when they allocated it, because when they allocated it, you didn't have these high power systems on both sides. So what ended up happening today is that after this auction, the spectrum on either side of it was auctioned for higher power, exclusive use to cellular carriers. So now we are in the situation where you have this low power piece sandwiched between these two. And there are all kinds of issues. There's adjacent channel issues between from these two edges. There's adjacent and co-channel issues in here because GAA coexistence. So if you had 2 users using so-called tier 3 licenses, they could be using the same channel. They could be right next to each other and causing interference to each other. That interference is not managed by the SAS, leading to co-channel interference. The other thing is these are all TDD bands. So in cellular, TDD means time division duplex. So you take your time and you divided it up into slots. Part of the time you're transmitting uplink, part of the time you're transmitting downlink. And that works great if everybody all across the band is transmitting uplink at the same time and downlink at the same time. If you don't do that, you start getting interference at these bands. So again, these were very technical issues that, again, when these systems were being designed on paper, it's not that people didn't know that they would arise, but the extent of how much interference you fully realized. Having said all of that, this band, in my mind, is one of the most innovative bands, and it's been called the innovation band, because what it has allowed people to do is deploy private cellular networks. So anybody can go out and buy a Wi-Fi access point and set it up and use it. They don't have to worry about licensing. Now you actually can do almost the same using a cellular system. You can set up your own private cellular network. And there are many, many applications where you want to do that. Things like smart factories, remote oil community networks in underserved areas. So the number of applications that you can do in this band is actually enormous. But we started thinking about, okay, how do we understand some of these problems better? And we were quite fortunate in that in South Bend, just a few miles from University of Notre Dame, the city decided to actually take advantage of the fact that they had this band to deploy a really nice network to serve the community, the low-income community, and they started this during COVID because a lot of the people who lived there did not have broadband access. They just relied on their phones for access. So this was an attempt to set it up. Very, very densely deployed network, not something we could ever set up in a lab to study. So we started using this deployment as a lab. Students spent a lot of time walking and driving and biking around this area, 12 square kilometers. Collected a lot of data from SIGCAP. We were able to identify exactly what frequencies each of these beams used and the overlap regions. We identified co-channel, adjacent channel problems. This, again, we do using just phones and very detailed analysis. And we were actually able to go back to the operator and tell them, look, you've put these two beams on these two channels and they're interfering with each other. And they would change it and the performance would improve. So there is a real value that we gotten by taking measurements from the user point of view and using those measurements to improve your deployment. Again, a lot of details here that I won't go into. Switching now to Wi-Fi. 6 gigahertz was a band that was made available for unlicensed use by the FCC in 2020. So that's about 5 years ago. So they took 1.2 gigahertz of a band that was in use. It had incumbents. And the main incumbent you have are these microwave links. So this is, if you've ever, the next time you're out and about, look for, say, towers and look for round antennas. Those are microwave links. So those links are used for a variety of purposes. They're used by utility companies to backhaul your electric grid information. They're used by television stations to backhaul video and other programming from one place to another. They're used by public safety links, again, for backhauling information. But it's a very, very, it's densely used in terms of number of links, but it's sparsely used spatially. So it's a narrow beam pointed at each other. And so the idea was, why can we not share that same frequency with other users? And so what we have today is an ecosystem in 6 gigahertz where those incumbents are still there. However, you can use this, say, indoors Wi-Fi, it's called low power indoor. There is no other automatic frequency control you need to do. You can today go out and buy Wi-Fi 6E APs, set them up and connect to them. You can do outdoor Wi-Fi APs today. Those are standard power, but for those you need automatic frequency control. Even though this is an unlicensed band, it's not a Wi-Fi band. People like to conflate unlicensed with Wi-Fi, but there's nothing that prevents an actual cellular system, and 5G actually has a specification called NRU, U for unlicensed. You could set up a 5G NRU base station if you want, which would be standard power with AFC. AFC can also be set up indoors if you wanted with standard power. Standard power allows you higher power, so there is an advantage for doing that. Very latest developments in this band are what are called very low power devices. So very low power devices are even lower power than low power indoor, and they have no AFC, so that gives you an additional layer of flexibility. This is a lot of what smart glasses are doing. So using this very low power connection between your glass and your phone to create literally display in your glasses. And then, but you still have to deal with all of these interactions. So you can still have interference from low power VLP, even with SP, if you've not coordinated it correctly. And then all of these devices have to coexist with each other. So it's a really rich spectrum use, honestly. And even though this has been deployed for a while now, incumbents, these guys here and gals, they are still very concerned that all of this is going to provide interference to them. So what we ended up doing is actually going to University of Michigan in 2023, because they were the first big university that had deployed Wi-Fi at scale. Took a bunch of measurements, and this was just SIGCAP, nothing else but just a bunch of phones using SIGCAPs. We walked around, we drove, well, I didn't, my students, they walked, they drove. They even strapped a phone on a drone and sent it up and down the building. So that's, again, the beauty of doing a phone-based thing. It's very, very versatile. Many, many measurements inside and outside. And basically, we showed that, you know, there really isn't a concern from low power indoor, because by the time these signals leak out from these buildings, they're usually very low. We did see a very high measurement from the drone, and that was because the drone was outside a corner office, which had glass on both sides, so it was really close, but statistically, it wasn't an interference concern. And some of these results we actually presented to the FCC to inform them as they were looking at further policy in 6 gigahertz. The most latest thing that we did was last year when the University of Notre Dame in their stadium deployed about 900 access points using standard power. And these were deployed in the railings like this. So they had 2 access points. They had Wi-Fi in 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. We set up a spectrum analyzer here to take measurements. And then again, just using SIGCAP, students walking around before and after a game, we were able to draw a number of very, very interesting conclusions, one of which was that, you know, when you have these many access points in such a small area, interference adds up. So the lower spectrum analyzer plot shows you what the spectrum analyzer output was during a post-game day, so when the stadium was empty, and this was during a game day. So the average level of interference rose. Now, this isn't something that the FCC had accounted for when they made the AFC rules. So clearly, not everywhere, but in certain areas where you have this kind of a dense deployment, perhaps the policies for the AFC should be different. I'll skip this last one. This was, again, more 5G testing, where we were really trying to understand, you know, how much has 5G really improved over 4G. And the key takeaways we showed is that, yeah, there was some improvement. And if you remember the capacity equation back then, most of the improvement we saw was because W went up, you know, not because we improved SNR by either using MIMO or other things. And so understanding what's happening in the real world, I think, is really important, because we're already talking about 6G, and we need to know what, you know, 5G and 4G did before we run off and design 6G. So I think what I'd like to do is conclude here. And basically, I hope you've gotten a good idea of what is capable with smartphones today. SIGCAP, you know, you're free to download it. But as I mentioned, if you don't want your location information to be shared, please don't upload it to the Firebase. We don't look at individual traces. We sort of conglomerate all the data we collect. But then if there is only one file that's uploaded from Albany, it becomes very clear that that's one file. But you can download it yourself. You can process it yourself. You can do a lot of local processing as well. So I'll stop there, and you don't have too much time for questions, but I'm happy to take some if there are any.
Thanks, Monisha. All right, any questions throughout any of the sites?
There's one here, Maria.
Go ahead.
Will this app ever be available for iPhones?
For Apple, you know, this is a research tool, right? I mean, for us, we we were really interested in getting some data, and the hurdles to build it, there's no reason it cannot be, there's no technical reason. It's really more having, working with the iOS ecosystem and getting it on their app store, and getting around all the disclaimers you need because of privacy and data collection. And it's not that it's not doable. I mean, there are a lot of apps that have done it. And I'm happy to collaborate. I think Mohammed would be happy to collaborate with people to see how to do this on a wider scale. But right now, it's basically an Android-based app.
Cool. All right. Any more questions or comments? We hope we'll have you next year to teach us how to develop this kind of apps. And
well, for that you don't need me. You need my students because yeah.
Awesome.
But I'm happy to do that. And if anybody wants to use it or have questions as you're beginning to use it, please feel free to reach out.
Great. You parents, hands up. So you guys have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I apart from the received signal spread, how do you know if there's an interference in certain line? Is it just by looking at the signal spread, or
the audio is coming across very muffled. I personally couldn't make out the question.
I couldn't either.
Were you able to? I'm not sure what we did about the audio.
Can you hear me better now?
I think
it's
so.
A
Yeah.
little better, yeah.
Okay. So my question is, how do you know if there is an interference in a band? Is it just by looking at the received signal strength, or is there any other metric?
Right. So
Okay.
how do you know that there's interference based on what you're measuring?
So let's think in cellular, there is a quantity called reference signal received quality, RSRQ, which there is a relation. So we get signal strength measurement, that's RSRP, and we get RSRQ, which is the signal quality measurement. And if your RSRQ level is very poor, there is likely co-channel interference. Now, we cannot identify where it's coming from. Most of the time in a cellular network, RSRQ is low because of self-interference. Another cell of the same network on that frequency is interfering with you. So we can identify that there is co-channel interference, maybe. We cannot identify the source particularly. For the 6 gigahertz, what we were trying to quantify is, do the signal levels that we are measuring, do we think that those signal levels will create interference to the incumbent in the same band? So that was a different analysis where we are measuring signals from unlicensed Wi-Fi, and we are estimating how much that signal will affect an incumbent to show interference or not.
Thanks, everyone. So I think we're at time, but Monisha told us how to find her. So thanks again for joining us and for sharing your work.
Thank you.